Pilgrims gathered at the temple for the day of Pentecost. And so this was a strategic time when many people would be gathered there. And in chapter 2, verses 2 through 4, we have that whole section before it framed kind of in prayer. The disciples are praying early in that section, and then in chapter 2 and verse 1, they're all together in one place and in one accord. What are they doing? Well, presumably they're still praying. People may have been coming and going, but the prayer meeting is still going on. But in chapter 2, verses 2 through 4, we get the evidences of Pentecost as the Spirit is being poured out. Chapter 2 and verse 2, you have the sound of a mighty rushing wind. And that evokes a theophany. Often you have something like the sound of a wind when God reveals himself in the Old Testament. Also, it may be associated in Ezekiel 37 with resurrection life, end-time resurrection life. God sends his ruach, his Spirit, like a wind to revive the dry bones of his people and bring about the restoration of his people. So you have the wind. You also have fire in verse 3 of chapter 2. The fire again evokes a theophany. Often with God revealing his glory in the Old Testament, it comes like fire. But also fire is associated, like in Isaiah 66 and so on, fire seems to be associated with eschatological judgment, what would be understood as end-time judgment by interpreters in the first century. These are not repeated at later outpourings of the Spirit in the book of Acts. They're important here because they show that God is showing up. They also show like a foretaste of the future, a foretaste of eschatology. But they aren't repeated at subsequent outpourings of the Spirit in the book of Acts. That's not to say that they can never be repeated. They have been repeated at some outpourings of the Spirit in the past. The wind came, and I believe even the fire perhaps, at the outpouring of the Spirit at the beginning of the West Timor revival in Indonesia. You had fire also with the outpouring of the Spirit at Pandita Ramabai's orphanage in India in the early first decade of the 20th century, around 1904 or so. But the third sign that is given in this case is that they begin praying in tongues. They begin speaking in other languages. And tongues is the most significant of these three for Luke because it's repeated at initial outpourings in chapter 10, verse 46, and chapter 19 and verse 6. It's also clearly important because it provides the catalyst here for the multicultural audience. It gets people's attention, and it gets people's attention cross-culturally in this case. Jewish people from all these different locations who are parts of a variety of cultures in a secondary way. It also sets up for Peter's message because it says, when this sound was heard, people said, "What does this mean?" And Peter says, "This is what Joel meant when he said, 'I'll pour out my Spirit on all flesh, your sons and daughters will prophesy.'" Well, it relates to Acts' theme in chapter 1 and verse 8. You say, how is that? Peter interprets it in 2:17 and 18 as the spirit of prophecy about which Joel spoke. Acts chapter 1 and verse 8 talks about the Spirit empowering us for witness. How do these relate together? Remember what it says about witness in Acts chapter 1 and verse 8. This is inspired speech, inspired by the Spirit. It's prophetic speech that fits 2:17 and 18. But it's also Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the earth. It's cross-cultural speech. What greater sign could God give His church that He was empowering them to cross all cultural barriers than to enable people on the day of Pentecost to begin worshiping God in other people's languages? What greater way could He show them, this is the purpose for which I am empowering you with the spirit of prophecy? Not so you can entertain yourselves, but I am empowering you with the spirit of prophecy to send you to the ends of the earth. That's the purpose of the outpouring of the Spirit.